Hi, everybody. Welcome back to English 247, and this is for our class for Thursday, December 11th. And we are close to the ending of the semester. We are at our very last text, which is a novella, The Awakening. Not quite as long as a novel, but certainly longer than a short story. We end the semester the way we began. We started with The Story of an Hour by Keith Chopin, and even though it was a very short piece, I think you will recognize the writing style when we are discussing The Awakening. And that would leave just one last class for us. That is next Thursday, where we have our final examination. That would be the last date also for you to submit in paper number 2 or revisions for paper number 1. Basically, for the final examination is I will be posting the final at the time our class would normally meet, which is Thursday at 6 p.m. And you have 24 hours in which to complete that final exam. So that would be Friday at 6 p.m. I don't expect you to spend 24 hours on the exam. In an in-class situation, you would spend approximately 2 hours, give or take a little bit, on the final. So that's about as much time as I would expect that you would spend on this final, which is open book, open notes, so that you can access the documents from the class over the course of the semester. And basically, it'll be a series of essay questions from which you can choose. And the idea behind the final is that it is a synthesis of everything that we have been talking about over the course of the semester in Women in Literature. So it's not an examination that's factual. As you know, I like to oftentimes ask questions that require thought and argumentation. And of course, you don't know what the question or questions will be for the final exam. So the best way to prepare for the final is what you've been doing all semester long, which is reading the text and watching the class videos, answering the discussion forum questions. As you know, you're not required necessarily to interact with your peers in the discussion forum, though you're certainly encouraged to. But you are required to read all of your peers' responses and my responses in turn. So, in terms of reviewing, you might want to review some of the class videos. You might want to review some of the class discussion forum responses. And you also might want to review some of the notes over the course of the semester. As you know, I've been retiring previous weeks in our past class sessions folder, so you'll be able to find all of the notes and all of the class videos up until this particular point. And I'm certainly not expecting something as neat or as polished or as developed as what you would do with a paper, because you would have probably a couple of weeks to write a paper. Instead, what you've got is a couple of hours. But at the very least, I'm looking for you to be able to write an introduction, a body, and a conclusion, be able to put together some arguments about some of the themes that we've been talking about over the course of the semester. And I think ending with the awakening is perhaps a particularly important and appropriate text. The awakening is a text that led to the ending of Kate Chopin's career because it was considered so scandalous. And obviously, the text is about the awakening of our central character, her physical awakening, her emotional awakening, her intellectual awakening. And I'm hopeful that this class was also a kind of awakening, if you will, about the role of women in the 1800s and some of the pushback that some authors were exhibiting by questioning that role. And you can see that I put the text in chronological order, and I think you can also see that there is a progression in the text from implication to just being outright explicit, which is what the awakening is. You can see in the notes below that Kate Chopin lived a very unorthodox life, not surprising, considering what she wrote about. She indicated she was bored with parties. Think about what that would mean after reading Persuasion, for instance. She would read literature And we know from the very beginning of the semester where we talked about the cult of true womanhood, the dangers associated with reading literature, because it could lead to questions in the reader's mind that would ultimately lead to the questioning of the status quo, especially in terms of female position in society. She smoked cigars, and even that might be considered unconventional in today's world. She walked alone. Think about the story of an hour when Mrs. Mallard spent time alone, and that in and of itself would be considered unusual behavior. Insisted on privacy, dressed unconventionally. We talked about this in the beginning of the semester, the importance of dress and either maintaining the status quo. The idea of uncomfortable clothing helps to restrict female. And she ran the family plantation after her husband's death. Some of the themes of self assertion and repressed sexuality and independence appear suggested in the story of an hour, but are much clearer in The Awakening, where again we see the intellectual, emotional, and physical awakening of female. And a couple of the points that I wanted to emphasize about that particular text. In the first book, we are introduced to birds, and we know that Kate Chopin is fond of bird imagery. We saw that with Mrs. Mallard and with sparrows in the story of an hour. Here we have the image of a caged bird being a symbol for female being caged. Notice that this bird is speaking an incomprehensible language. We do get a translation, which is get out. And obviously, this is what Edna is trying to do. She feels caged and is trying to get out, but nobody understands her language. One might say that Chopin is saying the same thing. By all accounts, Chopin had a happy marriage. So this isn't necessarily autobiographical. But of course, Chopin would have had to live within a society that was restrictive to women, even though her marriage may not necessarily have been restrictive. And in that first book, we see how important swimming is and the sea and water imagery. She's swimming without a wedding ring, which is supposed to represent freedom from her marriage. In book 3, Mr. Pontellier, her husband, who's much older than she is, and it seems to be very much a suitable match, again, if you want to think about persuasion, disappointed that his wife is not interested in his concerns and is not more attentive to the children. Of course, there isn't any discussion about whether or not he is interested in her concerns and why he isn't more attentive to the children. That isn't seen as his responsibility. He looks forward to leaving the family for the excitement of work in the city. They're vacationing at this point, and the idea is that he comes back on weekends. They're at an ocean resort that they visit every year. And of course, that leaves Edna the opportunity for independence, freedom, and for meeting people. And that's exactly what happens over the course of the novel. And to give you an idea of the kind of sentiment that Edna is surrounded by, in book 4, risky behavior, at least for Madame Ratignolle, is selecting a bonbon that might be too rich and hurt her. And of course, that's a wonderful metaphor for perhaps what Edna is trying to do as well, and trying to break out of the constraints of society. The sea is such a seductive force because the tides going in and out, very suggestive sexually. But also, it's symbolic of the womb. And the sea can cleanse, it can rejuvenate, it can caress, it can offer freedom, it can offer escape. And of course, it presents danger as well. And she begins, Edna, to realize her position as an independent being. I don't think it's any mistake that she's in her late 20s, which is a pivotal time for female. Again, that's something that we talked about with persuasion. In book 7, Edna removes her collar and opens her dress at the throat. Some subtle symbolism about freedom. She talks about her passionless marriage to Mr. Pontellier and how she's fond in an uneven way of the children. And this is a major difference between the story of an hour and the awakening. There were no children mentioned in the story of an hour. So the awakening is a more complex text in that respect. In book 9, Mademoiselle Reisz plays Chopin, the musician. There's a pun there on the name of Chopin for the author as well. Edna is struck by the passion of the music. Edna has passion, and a woman is not necessarily supposed to feel passion, particularly physical passion. In book 10, when Edna learns how to swim, that's supposed to be representational of independence and power. And note how all the men take credit for teaching her how to swim, and they never acknowledge her own actions in terms of learning how to swim. I think that says everything. In book 11, Edna and her husband have a battle of wills as to who's going to go inside the house first. Mr. Pontellier wins ultimately. If you've ever heard the expression that, you might lose the battle but win the war, it's, I think, very comparable in this particular instance that Edna is going to have bigger battles with Mr. Pontellier, but this seemingly minor episode is illustrative of the desire for power that is going on in this relationship, and how Edna is trying to find a way to have voice and power within relationship. In book 13, this is where Edna experiences her physical awakening. This is when she is going to take a nap. She's stretching out in bed and she's beginning to appreciate her body as a physical entity. And then when she awakes from her nap, she's hungry. And of course, that hunger is literal, but it's also figurative. She's not just hungry for food, she's hungry for life. She's hungry for freedom, for independence. And we see as the novel progresses that Edna has become infatuated with a character named Robert. She's quite upset that he's leaving town because she can no longer spend time with him. And she realizes, much as has happened to her in the past, that she's infatuated. As the novel progresses, or I should say the novella progresses, she realizes that she really is more than just infatuated with him. What Edna says in book 16, I think, is quite telling, when she says she would never sacrifice herself to anyone, even her children, although she would give up her life for them. And there's a little bit of foreshadowing with this in terms of how the novel ends, or the novella ends. I hope you've gotten to the end at this point so that this isn't a spoiler when I say that Edna commits suicide by drowning, going out into the sea and swimming out as far as she can. And the assumption is that she tires, so she doesn't have enough energy to be able to swim back in, so that ultimately this is where she dies. And I think this quote is quite significant because Edna won't give up herself, but she will give up her life. And notice the thematic parallel with the story of An Hour, where it seems that death is the means for escape for a female. In book 17, Edna refuses to take callers. Again, think about how important this would be in a world of persuasion, for instance, and on her Tuesdays afternoons, as is her custom. And there's a scene, seemingly minor, with her eating with Mr. Pontellier. He keeps seasoning his soup, which is quite bland, which is supposed to be illustrative of their lives, which is quite bland. She's looking for passion. And Edna tries to throw away her wedding ring, but the maid returns it to her. Obviously, Edna comes from a certain position of privilege. Think about that in contrast to the text that we talked about last week, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl. And both would be happening around the same time period. Two completely different worlds. And Edna says in book 18 that she doesn't envy the domestic harmony of the Ratignollis. She's supposed to, she knows that. But that's not what is going to give her fulfillment in life. In book 19, Mr. Pontellier is shocked and angered that Edna is disregarding her duties as a wife and mother, and wonders if she's mentally unstable. And this would oftentimes be the go-to, that if a woman wasn't fulfilling the societal expectations of the time, then she must be insane. Now, we talked a little bit about mental instability in Jane Eyre, and about how ultimately Bertha Mason is kept in the attic, which is a wonderful symbol or metaphor for female that didn't necessarily fit into societal expectation. If you've ever read Charlotte Perkins' The Yellow Wallpaper, then you know what I'm referencing here. But thinking about if you wanted to investigate further this idea, I recommend that you read Why Sargasso Sea, which is written by Jean Rice, which is a fictional examination of Bertha prior to her time with Rochester to give a little bit more depth to the character of female during this time period. And Mr. Pontellier is so shocked and angered that Edna is disregarding her duties as a wife and mother. Again, think about the cult of true womanhood and the duties of purity and piety and domesticity and submissiveness, and how that really doesn't apply to Edna in this particular novella. Not only does he wonder if she's mentally unstable, he basically seeks out the help of a doctor. Um, Edna learns, meanwhile, that Robert is writing letters about her to Mademoiselle Reisz. So the idea is that ultimately Robert is also having emotional connection to Edna in the way that she is to him. The physician that Mr. Pontellier visits in chapter 22 um, wonders if a man might be involved, but out of decorum doesn't state his concerns out loud. And again, the idea of decorum is so important during this time period. And Mr. Pontellier talks about how his wife is making him, quote, uncomfortable, unquote. And I think, again, this is quite telling in terms of the roles of society and the duties of female. Edna even admits that she's happy that her husband is often at work because if he were home, what would they talk about? I mean, they were a good match, so to speak, using the language of persuasion, but ultimately they don't necessarily have an emotional connection, which it seems that Edna and Robert do, as well as a physical connection. And Edna's father thinks that Mr. Pontellier is much too lenient with his wife, and meanwhile, Edna is enjoying solitude and the leisure to read. And again, think about how that applies to the paper topic that I had suggested for paper number 1 and paper number 2. Not that you couldn't write on a different paper topic, but if you did, you wanted to get approved by me. The idea that a book could ruin a woman, how scandalous. In fact, this is how the awakening begins, is that there is a book that's going around that Edna finds to be so scandalous, but notice the awakening that Edna undergoes over the course of the novella. So now she's reading on her own. This is book 24. And then Edna begins spending time with another man, book 25, Mr. Arobin, who is infatuated with her. And Edna wonders not what her husband would think of this relationship, but what Robert would think of this relationship. There are many scandalous elements within this novella. Ultimately, Edna decides to move out. So this is in chapter 26. She's going to rent and move into a small house of her own. Note that it's called the Pigeon House. Again, more bird imagery. Around the corner, which she can afford to pay for on her own. She has financial independence because she has a small inheritance and also an income that she generates from her art, from selling her sketches. And Edna is quite pleased to hear that Robert is returning and ultimately at this point admits that she loves him. And Edna admits freely that she knows her character would be viewed as wicked, certainly during this time period, perhaps even during our own time period. This is in chapter 27. But that's not going to stop her actions. She kisses Arobin, she feels passion for him, and ultimately they consummate their relationship. And her regret is not about the fact that she's married or what her husband will think. Her regret is that her lover is not Robert. And then we find out that Edna is turning 29 in book 30. Again, a pivotal life stage year. Moving into the 30s is very different than being in the 20s, particularly for the female and the importance of youth for female, even in today's world. And Mr. Pontellier, when he learns that his wife has moved out, he's very concerned about what the neighbors will think. That perhaps the neighbors will think that they are experiencing a financial decline. This goes all the way back to persuasion. That kind of thinking would be the thinking of a Sir Walter Elliot, if you will. Robert finally returns to town in chapter 33, and Robert sees Arabin's picture at Edna's house, and he's jealous. Of course, why would Edna have a picture of Arabin? Obviously, there's some kind of relationship going on. Edna ultimately kisses Robert, and they admit that they have attraction and even love for one another in chapter 36. This is when Edna is summoned by Madame Ratignolle, the mother woman, to her birth. Not that Edna is necessary for birthing Madame Ratignolle's baby, but Madame Ratignolli wants to remind Edna about her role as mother and the importance of fulfilling her role as mother. And Ratignolli tells Edna, think of the children, because she's aware, as many are aware based on Edna's actions, that obviously she is having doubts about her marriage at the very least, and perhaps an active relationship or relationships at the very most outside of her marriage. Edna returns home and Robert is gone. It turns out Robert has some honor after all. He leaves saying that he needs to go because he loves her. He doesn't want Edna to have to sacrifice her family, to have to sacrifice her reputation, to have to sacrifice her life for their relationship. And what Edna says at the end, I think, is quite telling, is that even Robert doesn't understand that she would not sacrifice herself for anyone. And that his belief that somehow Edna would be giving over herself to Robert is misguided, because Edna is unable to give herself over to anyone. That eventually she would feel just as trapped by Robert or Arabin or anybody else. So what she does is that she undresses, again, the idea that she's returning to her primal state. She's nude, and she goes into the sea naked and swims until she's exhausted. And what we aren't told, but what we can gather, almost like Joy That Kills in the story of an hour, is that she's drowned herself. And as I've suggested, there are many scandalous incidents in this novella. That's going to be our final discussion forum response, which is due Saturday the 13th. And again, if you need a little bit additional time, please let me know. What do you think is the most scandalous act in The Awakening? And oh boy, there are quite a few. And why? And obviously, The Awakening is a very different text than take something like Frankenstein, a very male centric text that gave us, while occasionally we would have a female that would break the stereotype that would be discussed in The Cult of True Womanhood. Ultimately, what we had was the female pretty much illustrating what was expected of the time period. Justine might be somewhat of an example that contradicts that idea. But now we've gone to the opposite extreme. So, again, next Thursday would be the day of our final examination, and it is open book, open notes, so you can access the class. And of course, you're not expected to spend 24 hours. You have 24 hours to do the examination, but you're expected to spend approximately a couple of hours or so and responding with an essay. Almost inevitably, students ask, how long should my essay be? I don't mean to be facetious when I say as long as it needs to be. But basically, it should have an introduction, a body, and a conclusion. All essays do. Outside of that is what can you accomplish in the time frame that you have. And that would be our very last day of the semester, would be Thursday of next week. That's the last day to hand in papers. That is the last day to hand in revisions. So that said, I'm going to leave you here so that if you haven't finished The Awakening, definitely do so, because that will be of assistance to you in thinking about the semester as a whole. And I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well. And we will continue on next class with our final examination. Take care. Bye bye.